Okay, so let's talk about, we talked about the end of last time. Remember we talked about genetic drift vaguely, and we said that humans are actually come from a event where there's a huge genetic bottleneck. Some people call it the Togo event. There's actually a name for it. That's an estimation. Estimates go as far as 10,000 to 5,000 humans. So back several thousand years ago, all humans everywhere pretty much went extinct except for a very small little population of humans. And from that, we all come from that small little island. So that's really a genetic bottleneck. And a bottleneck idea is this. Here's this bottle, right? And each of these different colored marbles represents an allele. Okay? Some mass extinction happens where 99% of the people in that population die out. What happens? Only a few numbers of the population continue on. But what's happened between this and this? Change. What do you notice is missing here that's in here? Yellow. The yellow marble, or here an allele. So because of genetic bottlenecks, there's a loss of very low frequency alleles. And you might say, so what? But that allele might be beneficial in certain situations. So your population is less genetically diverse. Where is this a major problem? When you reintroduce species, California condors, you've all heard of these different things where they introduce new species, right? Like something's on the brink of extinction, they do captivity stuff, and then they bring it back. But the problem is when they bring it back, a lot of times that population is not a very diverse, genetically speaking population. Okay. So the founder effect is when there's genetic drift and you start a new population from very limited number of individuals. And that can be a problem because you're losing alleles when you constrain a population. Another thing we see with this is inbreeding. And this is when, I think we all know what inbreeding is, right? Okay, why is that a problem? Why is inbreeding a problem? Yes. Essentially what happens, one thing with inbreeding is if you have someone who's a carrier and another person who's a carrier, is there a chance that those carriers might get together and have a homozygous recessive and possibly a problem with a child? Exactly. Remember we talked about Tay-Sachs? We talked about that disease that primarily is seen in Eastern European Jewish communities. And before any type of marriage ceremony, they will, a rabbi will actually have a genetic test done to see if both parents are carriers. Because there's been essentially interbreeding in that population. Not close interbreeding, but there's been a lot of marriage between somewhat closely related groups. There's a large percentage of these Tay-Sachs alleles and a large percentage of carriers, meaning that there's a pretty good chance that you're going to get two carriers coming together and having a child with Tay-Sachs. They will advise them about the possibilities of what can happen. Sometimes a rabbi will not marry them, or they'll just give them advisement. Tell them, prepare them like there's a 1 in 4 chance of your child having Tay-Sachs, which is essentially a death sentence for a child. It's not a pretty death.
What's that
Oh, that's another one. Think of that like as Tay-Sachs. It's there. You can be a carrier and not affected, but when two carriers have a child, there's a 1 in 4 chance that there'll be a homozygous recessive and have that.
So it's kind of like the same thing.
Exactly. The same idea that two carriers can come together and have a full-blown case of it. No, not what the disease does, no, but genetically that if you have inbreeding, you have a large number of carriers, and there's a better chance that they will form a homozygous recessive. Okay. And we're just talking about just a bunch of terms we got to know here. Gene flow is the movement of alleles into and out of a population. So as populations move, they're going to take their alleles with them. But then populations also can have alleles brought into them. Immigration, people coming into a population, that can bring alleles in. Immigration with an E, that can take alleles out. Now this is the physical movement. This is not caused by mutation or events like that. This is actually people getting up and going and leaving the gene pool and taking their alleles with them. All right. Now we're going to talk about reproductive isolation and speciation. So that's the next topic here. So speciation is how new species are formed. And we're going to talk about some of the mechanisms by which they are formed. More specifically, we're going to talk about different types of reproductive isolation. And the thing is, if you have reproductive isolation, what happens is if some species somehow cannot reproduce, they form two species that are closely related, and over time, those will diverge into two separate species. So that's the point here, that if you have reproductive isolation, you're going to form a split, a bifurcation in a species, and form two different species over time. Okay. So some of the mechanisms for this. One type of mechanism for reproductive isolation is prezygotic mechanisms. Basically, okay, so what's a zygote? Start off with that question. What's a zygote? When I say zygote, what am I talking about? Combination of sperm and egg. So if we can somehow prevent a sperm and egg from fertilizing into a viable zygote, that would all fall into prezygotic isolation. Good example of that, let me say it this way, if the parts don't fit together. Well, I'll be honest, biology is not. I'll let you figure that one out for yourself. Another one is if there was a sperm entering into an egg, that the genetic material does not coalesce and actually form a viable zygote. Think of like a dog sperm entering a cat egg. You're going to have, the genetics are so different between the two, even if you were to somehow take it and physically puncture the egg and put the sperm inside, it's not going to become a viable zygote. That would fall under prezygotic. Postzygotic, on the other hand, if there is fertilization and there is a birth, then the postzygotic isolation will interfere or somehow weaken their ability to reproduce. And I know we all know an example of that one. What's a great example of that one? Liger, tiger and a lion. Another one? Zebra. Well, there's another one that's more, what was that? A donkey. So tell me about a donkey. What is that? A horse and a mule makes a donkey, and can a donkey reproduce? Was it the other way around? Is it a horse and donkey make a mule? Okay. I get them mixed up. But anyhow, horse and donkey makes a mule. But the point is a mule reproductively capable? No. So that's a postzygotic isolation. That they can't form they cannot form offspring because they are a hybrid. You mean the leprechauns in Montgomery? Oh, that's an internet meme right there. Okay. So we're gonna talk about each one of these zygotic mechanisms. Prezygotic is temporal isolation. When one, say the female is fertile and when the male is fertile, is a different time. Mechanical isolation, the parts don't fit together. One's too small or one's too large. Behavioral isolation, the mating behavior of one, the other one looks at them and gives them like a what the heck are you doing, man? And that, the guy's doing this and the female's like, what? Okay, because males do things to attract females, right? Like males have plumage and that attracts females. Well, if another bird doesn't get the idea of the plumage, they'll look at all these pretty feathers and like, I don't get it. So behavioral isolation, what attracts one species to another varies. And then gamete incompatibility, that's when if you were to put a sperm into an egg, the genetic material simply does not coalesce. Okay. Now postzygotic, we already hit on these. Someone already said this, the ligers, the tigrans, they're missing or they have extra genes or they're missing genes. But they're not as hardy. They can survive, but they're just simply not as hardy as their parents. Another one is fertility. The other ones are nearly infertile. Or they're sterile. So you have a mule, a horse, and a donkey would make a mule. That is an example of that. But the whole point is that these are all ways in which reproduction is limited. That's the whole point, reproductive isolation. Okay. Another concept you've got to know, and you hear a lot about this in biology, is allopatric speciation. When some type of physical barrier forms between two species, or some type of barrier exists between two species, and that forms two new species. So for example, let's say during the Ice Age, right? During the Ice Age, what happened to the water levels in the world? They dropped, right? We got this land bridge between Asia and North America. People took a walk across and they started living in North America. Great. Okay, so what happens when the water goes up? They're stuck, right? There's that land bridge is flooded, and we have two separate groups of the same species. But over time, those two species are going to evolve differently. And over time, they will evolve to different species. You see, this is why we mentioned continental drift. Because as the continents divide, you got the same species on one continent, and there's a division, and over time, those two species, they start evolving at different rates, and there's different pressures on each of those species. Okay. There's a couple others. Sympatric is when there's a physical barrier. I'm sorry, I get sympatric and parapatric. Sympatric is when there's not a physical barrier that forms. That some type of mutation causes a group of species to become incompatible with the nearby species. Good example of this is polyploidy in plants, where there's a change on the genetic level and a small group of plants are not able to reproduce with nearby plants that they came from. Okay. And then the third type of speciation is parapatric speciation. And this is what happens. You have two areas of different species, and between the borders of those two species, a hybrid forms. And that hybrid becomes a new species unto itself. With this example, they're trying to show you that these two different centipedes were here, and there's a boundary zone between the two. And they hybridized and they formed a new species that was different than the other two species. Okay, so just let me summarize these different speciation models. Allopatric, sympatric, and parapatric, the original population is one large population. With allopatric speciation, some type of physical barrier forms between the two. Okay, water, a land bridge disappearing, continents dividing, you name it. Somehow, some way, some physical barrier splits that one species into two separate ones. Over time, those two species then develop into separate species unto themselves. Sympatric is a genetic change. We start with one population, and in a very small subset, something happens on a genetic level where that small subset can no longer reproduce with the other species. Over time, they form their own little niche, and over time, they form their own species. And then the third one that we just talked about, parapatric. Okay, that's that boundary line between two zones, and some hybrid forms between those two, and it forms a new niche or a new species. Okay. Coevolution. This is a good one. Coevolution. So what do you think about coevolution? What do you think it sounds like? It's like two, okay? A good example of this one is like this tick-tock mechanism. Example, you got a bird and a mouse, right? Okay, so the birds go after the mice, right? Swoop down and grab the mouse. Okay, so the mouse will evolve something about it. It can develop some type of new camouflage, right? Something that obfuscates it from the birds. And then those mice that develop that mutation and can elude the birds, they're going to reproduce, and that mouse population will, over time, have that selective pressure on it and then have that adaptation. So the birds are in trouble, right? The birds can't catch the mice, so what do the birds do? Evolve, exactly. The birds that are best suited to counter that mutation, they evolve, and then they start getting the mice back. And the birds that were able to do that pass their alleles to the next generation, and then future birds have those characteristics. And then the mice are now in the hot seat. And then the mice evolve something different, and then it passes that hot potato back to the birds. But the point is this: one group will evolve and make the other group have to evolve. And then one group evolves, and then the other group has to evolve to counter that. I liken it to these handset makers, Apple and Android, right? That Apple comes up with something, and then it makes Android look like it's old and stale, and looks like it's made from BlackBerry or something. So then Android comes back with Google, and they come up with something new, right? And then, Apple's like, oh no, we're losing market share. Let's put up a 4-point-inch screen and look cool. And then the other people, and this motion over time that. Well, it's a good analogy. But, there is this evolution. One species is driving the evolution of the other one, and that is then, in turn, driving the evolution of the other one. We got that one? Yeah. All right. Stasis is an idea where there is very little change over millions of years. The coelacanth, great example. That's an interesting example, actually. We had found in the geographical record 100,000 million years ago, there's this fish. It was like this lunged fish, and it's kind of an unusual fish. And for years, we thought this fish is extinct. And in the literature, it was always mentioned this is an extinct fish. And lo and behold, about 100 years ago, well, 90 years ago, someone's fishing in South Africa in that area, and guess what they found? A lungfish, a coelacanth. So they found a fish that was almost identical to what was in the geologic record. Okay, so that's an example of stasis where there's very, very little change. What term did we call that? Another similar term. Begins with G and E. Genetic equilibrium. Remember genetic equilibrium? That was an impossible thing, but we said that some are very close to that. So some groups have a very slow change. That's stasis. That if there's a very slight evolutionary change over millions of years, that is stasis. Some insects, ants are another example of this, that there's a very low level of evolution happening. Okay. No, don't worry about that. Just stasis is what you need to know. Okay, adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is this burst of speciation. That there is these spurts, these punctuated just pops of new species forming. Now, there's a theory out there, and I'm going to say it's a theory, but it's kind of supported by the record. I know I've mentioned this before. Do you guys know about the poles shifting on Earth every 10,000 years or so? Well, and we're actually in the middle of a pole shift now. So in a few hundred years, what's the North Pole, or what would face with your compass pointing north, will actually go south. What's the point of this? During these events, okay, you're going to see changes in the protective layer of Earth, meaning that during one of these shifts, Earth is more penetrated by radiation from the sun. And there's a theory out there that goes that during these times of extra radiation from the sun, that we see an increase in mutations, and these increase in mutations lead to this burst of speciation happening. Because there's a lot of mutations happening relative to when the magnetic field is normal. And that's just a theory, but when you line up the speciations and these events, they really do line up in a very regular pattern. Okay, but just know what adaptive radiation is. A burst of speciation happens. That's pretty much self-explanatory, actually. So just know adaptive radiation. Adaptive radiation is the one. Okay. An extinction. Extinction is there is a total loss of species from Earth. Mass extinction is when lots of different ones go at one time. The KT divide, that's a divide where we think that there is a large geological event, and multiple species on Earth had died. And when you look at the strata, you have strata, then there's this very thin layer, and then another layer of strata, almost as if there's some cataclysmic event on Earth. Okay, I think that wraps it up for that chapter. Let me make sure. That was chapter 18. I'm going to go for another 10 minutes, and then we'll call it do a real fast quiz and get you guys out of here. I'm sorry? You bet. Just know what extinction is and a mass extinction. A mass extinction is just, excuse me, when most of the species, or large numbers of species are extinct.